Have you ever noticed how some people, after doing something deeply wrong, don't show guilt in the way you'd expect? Instead of remorse, they cry in defense. They shift the story, twist the truth, and somehow make you the villain in their wrongdoing. It's disorienting, isn't it? The person you trusted the most looks into your eyes after breaking your heart and says, "If you treated me better, I wouldn't have done it." For a moment, you stop and question everything. But what's happening here isn't guilt, it's psychological manipulation. It's a form of emotional protection disguised as sorrow, designed to shift responsibility away from the person who caused the harm. Understanding how this pattern works is crucial because if you don't, you can end up believing you were the cause of someone else's betrayal. Before we unpack this emotional maze, remember that this isn't about blaming one gender or attacking people. It's about awareness, about recognizing how emotional deflection and self-justification can cloud the truth. Because in relationships, when someone cheats or betrays trust and then blames you for it, what's actually happening is a psychological defense known as self-concept preservation. The mind resists viewing itself as bad, so it bends the story until it feels emotionally safe again. That bending of reality, where the betrayer becomes the victim, is where the manipulation begins. You'll often hear statements like, "You made me feel unloved," or "You were distant, so I found comfort elsewhere." Those words sound emotional, even sincere, but they're not true confessions. They're emotional deflections. They shift the moral weight away from the betrayer and onto the betrayed. This is how guilt is disguised as explanation. And if you're someone who cares deeply, who naturally tries to understand and fix things, this tactic can pull you into a spiral of self-doubt. You start wondering, maybe I did push them away, maybe I wasn't enough. But that's the trap. Nothing you did forced them to betray your trust. Betrayal is always a choice. Everyone has the option to communicate pain instead of inflicting it. This is what separates healthy relationships from manipulative ones. Loyalty doesn't depend on perfection, it depends on character. When someone wrongs you and then blames you, they're not defending love, they're defending ego. They're trying to maintain a sense of being the good person, even after doing something wrong. This is where the emotional rewriting begins. In their version of events, they're not the one who cheated or lied. They're the one who was driven to it. It's a subtle but powerful shift that turns betrayal into self-justification. For many people, this rewriting isn't a conscious act. It's an emotional reflex, a psychological survival mechanism. Shame is a heavy emotion, and for some, it's unbearable. Instead of processing it, they offload it. They project their guilt onto you, forcing you to carry what was never yours to begin with. This process is what psychologists refer to as blame shifting, a way of managing internal conflict by transferring responsibility. It can be deeply confusing, especially when you're emotionally attached to the person doing it. The manipulation doesn't start with anger, it starts with tears. Tears are powerful because they signal vulnerability. And if you're someone with empathy, your natural instinct is to comfort, not confront. That's where emotional confusion takes root. The one who caused pain uses emotional displays to redirect attention away from their actions and toward your supposed failures. The narrative becomes, "I wouldn't have done this if you didn't make me feel this way." It's emotional misdirection, a performance that plays on your compassion. And here's the most painful part. Many people on the receiving end of this manipulation start to believe it. Because when you love someone, you want to understand them. You want to believe that there's a reason behind their actions, something you can fix. But betrayal isn't born from emotional emptiness, it's born from entitlement. It's the belief that one's personal needs justify breaking promises. When a person begins to crave validation outside their relationship, they start bending their own moral boundaries to make it feel acceptable. They convince themselves it's not really wrong, it's just something they needed. So when you confront them, you're not just facing their guilt, you're facing their rewritten story. A story where you're the cold one, the inattentive one, the person who drove them into someone else's arms. This isn't reconciliation, it's narrative control. By turning the spotlight onto your flaws, they shift attention away from their decisions. They'll bring up past arguments, highlight your weaknesses, and remind you of moments when you fell short. The goal isn't clarity, it's confusion. Because once you're uncertain, once you start doubting your memory of events, they've regained power over you. This psychological tactic is often called emotional gaslighting, the deliberate distortion of truth to make someone question their own reality. It's one of the most disorienting experiences a person can go through. You begin to question not just what happened, but who you are. You start apologizing for things you didn't do, trying to win back the affection of someone who betrayed you. You try to fix what they broke, and in doing so, you lose sight of your own worth. The betrayal becomes a loop, a cycle where guilt and love mix into a form of emotional imprisonment. At its core, this is about control. The person who blames you for their cheating or betrayal isn't seeking forgiveness, they're testing influence. They want to see if they can still shape your emotions. If they can make you feel responsible for their decisions, they know they still hold power over your heart. And power, in the hands of someone who manipulates, becomes a form of emotional currency. It's not about rebuilding trust, it's about maintaining dominance in the relationship's emotional hierarchy. This is why such manipulation feels so haunting. It doesn't end with the betrayal itself. It lingers in your mind, replaying through doubt and guilt. You might even find yourself defending the person who hurt you, explaining away their actions to friends, or worse, to yourself. That's what emotional rewriting does. It makes you forget the original story. You start believing that maybe it was a misunderstanding, or that both of you were equally at fault. But deep down, something feels off. The pieces don't fit because the truth has been rearranged. Healing begins the moment you stop trying to correct their version of events and start standing firm in yours. You can't win an argument with someone who's rewriting the past to protect their ego. The only way out is clarity, understanding that guilt isn't yours to carry. Cheating, lying, or betrayal of any kind is not an emotional accident. It's a decision, one that reveals not your shortcomings, but the other person's inability to confront their own moral boundaries. And when you finally see that, something inside you shifts. You stop chasing explanations. You stop needing them to understand how much they've hurt you. You start realizing that their tears aren't always truth, they're tactics. Their apologies aren't always accountability. They're attempts at control. And once that understanding sets in, their power over you begins to fade. You see through the manipulation, and what once felt like love begins to look like illusion. That's the first step toward emotional freedom, the realization that you were never the cause of their betrayal. You were simply the reflection of a truth they refused to face. When you start to see through emotional manipulation, you begin to understand that guilt has a purpose. It controls behavior. The more guilty you feel, the easier it becomes for the manipulative person to regain emotional dominance. This is what I call the guilt loop, a repeating cycle that keeps you emotionally invested in a relationship that no longer serves your peace. It starts the moment you confront the betrayal. You expect remorse, but what you get is reversal. They don't beg for forgiveness. They build a defense. They remind you of every time you fell short, of moments when you weren't perfect, of times you didn't meet their expectations. The message underneath is subtle. You drove me to this. That's not accountability, it's psychological projection. It's the process of transferring their internal guilt onto you so they can maintain the image of being the good one. When this happens, it's easy to slip into emotional confusion. Your brain begins to fight with your heart. You know they broke your trust, but you still care about them, and that emotional attachment becomes the perfect environment for manipulation to thrive. Most people who find themselves in this dynamic are naturally empathetic. They want to fix things. When someone they love is crying or expressing pain, their instinct is to comfort, not to judge, but that very compassion can be turned against them. The person who betrayed you understands this, consciously or not. They use tears, emotional stories, and self-pity to make you question your right to be angry. Suddenly, the focus shifts from their actions to your reaction. Instead of them explaining why they lied or cheated, you're explaining why you're upset. This is the emotional pivot that keeps the manipulator in control. It's no longer about the betrayal, it's about your behavior. They might say, "You're too angry," or "You're not listening," or "You always make me feel small." Each phrase pulls the emotional spotlight further away from their wrongdoing and places it on you. It's not just an argument anymore, it's psychological theater. The one who should be apologizing becomes the one being comforted. Here's what's happening psychologically. This pattern is driven by narrative control bias, the need to maintain a consistent, positive self-image even in the face of moral failure. When people do something that conflicts with their values, their mind creates justifications to bridge that gap. Instead of admitting, "I hurt someone," the internal voice says, "I had no choice." This bias allows them to preserve their identity as a good person while doing something that isn't. The justification doesn't erase guilt, it buries it under emotion. The tragedy is that once this story takes hold, it becomes almost impossible to reach them through logic. You can show evidence, recount timelines, and express your pain, but they'll always return to the emotional narrative. "I was lonely, I felt unwanted, you stopped caring." These are not explanations, they're emotional shields. They make their betrayal feel like a reaction instead of a decision. And this is where many people break down emotionally. They begin to internalize the blame. They start to change themselves, thinking, "If I become more attentive, more loving, more available, maybe they won't do it again." But this change isn't healing, it's submission. You're adjusting your behavior to accommodate someone else's lack of integrity. You're rewriting your own boundaries to make space for their excuses. This is the point where emotional conditioning begins. You start associating peace with compliance, believing that avoiding conflict is the same as restoring love. But real love can't exist where accountability is absent. When someone uses guilt as a weapon, what they're really doing is conditioning you to accept less, to see mistreatment as a misunderstanding and betrayal as emotional weakness. Over time, this conditioning rewires your emotional instincts. You start walking on eggshells, constantly monitoring your tone, your words, your reactions, anything to avoid triggering their defensiveness. The irony is, while you're trying to save the relationship, you're losing yourself. You become cautious where you used to be confident, quiet where you used to be expressive. This internal shrinkage is how emotional manipulation takes root. It doesn't destroy you at once, it erodes you quietly. Eventually, you might notice something unsettling. The person who betrayed you begins to look peaceful, even empowered, while you're the one carrying all the emotional weight. That's because they've offloaded their guilt onto you. By blaming you and watching you internalize it, they've achieved psychological relief. They no longer feel like the wrongdoer, they feel like the misunderstood one. They might even start talking about healing, growth, or forgiveness. But if you listen closely, their healing doesn't include taking responsibility. It's about moving on without ever admitting what they did. And that's the cruelest twist of this dynamic. You, the one who was hurt, end up shouldering both the pain and the guilt, while they walk away with peace built on denial. They'll post about second chances, about learning from mistakes, about how people change. But their change is superficial. It's not growth, it's image repair. They're rebuilding their self-concept, not their integrity. Psychologically, this works because human beings crave narrative closure. We want stories to make sense. When someone we love betrays us, our mind fights to make that betrayal fit into the story we believed about them. We don't want to see them as the villain because that makes our love story feel like a lie. So we accept partial truths. We tell ourselves that maybe it wasn't really betrayal, maybe it was confusion or emotional weakness or bad timing. That self-deception gives temporary comfort, but it prolongs the pain. Here's the deeper truth. A person who manipulates through guilt doesn't just betray your trust. They reshape your sense of reality. They teach you to doubt your instincts and to question your memory. This kind of psychological damage is often mistaken for insecurity, but it's actually a form of trauma response. Your brain becomes hypervigilant, always scanning for signs of deception, always replaying past conversations to find where things went wrong. You stop feeling safe, not just with them, but within yourself. Healing from this begins with clarity. You have to remind yourself of a simple but powerful truth. You are not responsible for someone else's choices. You can contribute to relationship challenges, yes, but betrayal, deceit, and manipulation are individual decisions. They reveal a person's values, not your failures. Once you internalize that, guilt begins to lose its grip. This clarity doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you start caring differently, caring about your peace more than their explanations. You stop waiting for closure from someone who built comfort on your confusion. You realize that the only closure you truly need is truth. The truth that says, what they did was their decision. What I do next is mine. And that realization is liberating, because when you stop engaging in the emotional tug of war, when you stop trying to fix what you didn't break, the manipulator loses their power. Their story collapses without your participation. You're no longer the character they can control, you're the author of your own recovery. The moment you stop explaining your pain to the one who caused it, you begin to heal. That's the power of self-awareness. It turns emotional chaos into clarity and guilt into strength. When the fog of confusion begins to lift, something powerful happens inside you. You stop seeing yourself as the broken one, and you start recognizing how deeply manipulation can distort love. You begin to realize that betrayal is not just about physical or emotional infidelity. It's about dishonesty at the level of truth itself. When someone cheats or lies and then blames you, they are not only rewriting the story between you, they are rewriting reality. They are telling a version of events that allows them to avoid the mirror. But the mirror doesn't lie. The reflection always remains, waiting for them to face it. At this stage, it's normal to feel conflicted. Part of you may still love them, still hope for redemption. But another part, the part that's growing stronger through pain, starts to whisper something different. You can love someone and still choose yourself. You don't need to hate them to heal. You just need to see the truth clearly and stop negotiating your self-worth. Because forgiveness without accountability isn't healing, it's surrender. It's a quiet form of self-abandonment disguised as compassion. You may find yourself at a crossroads. One path leads toward trying again, believing promises, and hoping that things will be different. The other leads toward peace, solitude, and self-repair. The first path often feels easier because it's familiar. The second one feels heavy at first because it's filled with silence and self-reflection. But that silence is where strength grows. When you stop trying to fix someone who refuses to face themselves, you start fixing the one person you actually can, you. This is where self-respect begins to take root. You start recognizing that real love can't thrive where truth is denied. You begin to see that emotional games, no matter how romantic they once felt, are not love, they're control. And control has no place in genuine connection. A relationship built on manipulation doesn't collapse because of anger. It collapses the moment clarity arrives. Once you see the pattern, the illusion loses its power. The same words that once made you doubt yourself now sound hollow. The same tears that once pulled your empathy now look rehearsed. You no longer see a victim, you see a person avoiding responsibility. And that realization is your freedom. Because once you stop feeding their narrative, they can't use it anymore. Manipulation survives on confusion and clarity starves it. When you respond not with anger but with calm understanding, when you refuse to argue, justify, or defend, you reclaim your peace. You stop playing the part they've written for you in their story. You begin to write your own. There's a quiet power in walking away without bitterness. People who rely on emotional control expect drama. They feed on chaos because it keeps them relevant in your emotional world. But when you choose calm indifference, when you don't react, don't explain, don't chase, they lose their hold. That silence is not weakness, it's wisdom. It's the sound of your boundaries returning. And eventually something remarkable happens. The pain that once consumed you begins to turn into understanding. You start to see the experience not as destruction, but as instruction. You recognize that being betrayed taught you what manipulation looks like, what self-worth feels like, and what love should never become. You learn that peace doesn't come from getting closure. It comes from realizing you don't need it. The person who lied to you can't give you truth. The one who hurt you can't give you healing. That has to come from within. From a psychological perspective, your healing will involve rewiring your emotional responses. Betrayal trauma triggers the same areas of the brain associated with survival instincts: fear, hypervigilance, and emotional dependency. This is why even after leaving a toxic relationship, you might still crave contact or closure. Your mind is seeking familiarity, not safety. To break that cycle, you must teach your nervous system new associations. Replace the urge to fix them with the habit of grounding yourself. When you feel anxiety rising, don't run to the source of pain. Sit with the feeling. Breathe through it. Over time, your body learns that peace isn't found in their presence, but in your own stillness. Self-healing after emotional manipulation also means reclaiming your perception. You may have spent months, even years, questioning your memory, your judgment, your sensitivity. That constant self-doubt doesn't disappear overnight. It takes conscious effort to rebuild trust in yourself. Start by acknowledging your intuition. The same intuition that sensed something was off before you even had proof. It wasn't wrong. You were gaslit into believing it was. So now, every time your inner voice speaks, listen to it. That's your emotional compass recalibrating. As you continue to grow, you might find empathy returning. Not for what they did, but for why they couldn't face themselves. That doesn't mean you excuse their behavior, it means you've risen above it. True healing doesn't come from revenge or resentment, it comes from understanding without re-entry. You can recognize someone's wounds without letting them wound you again. And here's an important truth: sometimes the apology you need will never come. They may never admit the manipulation, the lies, or the blame shifting, but that's okay because healing isn't about hearing them say, "I'm sorry." It's about you finally saying, "I see what happened, and I choose to move on." That's where closure lives, not in their words, but in your clarity. When you start living from that clarity, everything changes. You stop replaying the past and start shaping the future. You stop viewing yourself as someone who was betrayed and start seeing yourself as someone who learned. Betrayal, painful as it is, often awakens self-awareness. It teaches you boundaries, patience, emotional independence, and the difference between love that empowers and love that consumes. You realize that your empathy was never your weakness. It was your greatest strength. It just needed direction. So when you finally walk away, do it not in anger, but in peace. Don't try to prove your worth to the one who couldn't see it. You don't need to convince them of your value. You just need to remember it yourself. Every time you choose peace over chaos, honesty over excuses, and self-respect over temporary comfort, you're rebuilding the version of yourself that manipulation tried to destroy. And one day, perhaps unexpectedly, you'll look back not with bitterness, but with gratitude. Gratitude not for the pain itself, but for the awakening it caused. You'll realize that what felt like the end of your story was actually the beginning of your strength. That the person who tried to control your emotions taught you how to master them. That the betrayal that once broke you became the fire that refined you. Because in the end, healing isn't about erasing what happened, it's about rewriting its meaning. You can't change that someone betrayed your trust, but you can decide what that betrayal taught you. You can turn their manipulation into your motivation, their blame into your clarity, and their lies into your truth. You can rise, not in spite of what happened, but because of it. And when you do, you'll understand that the greatest victory isn't making them regret losing you. It's becoming so at peace with yourself that you no longer need them to. That's where real healing begins. When you stop carrying their guilt, when you stop explaining their actions, and when you stop letting their story define yours. That's the moment you return to yourself, calm, grounded, and finally free.